Is that the best the honorable Congresswoman can offer? This isn't a street protest. It's the Supreme Court. The words sliced through the chamber like a blade, dripping with mockery. Justice Clarence Thomas leaned back in his chair, lips curled into a smug smile, the faintest glimmer of amusement dancing in his eyes. Around him, a ripple of uneasy laughter rolled through the crowd. A few aides stifling chuckles, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. It wasn't just an insult, it was a dismissal, a public attempt to reduce Jasmine Crockett, a sitting congresswoman, a civil rights attorney, a woman who had clawed her way up from the margins, into a caricature. The cameras zoomed in. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes, snap back, or fidget. Instead, she simply inhaled, a slow, deliberate breath, and raised her gaze to meet Thomas's. It was the look of someone who had heard worse from men with far more power, and had beaten them anyway. Whispers coursed through the chamber like an electrical current. "Did he really just say that?" one journalist muttered under their breath. "She's not going to let that slide," another replied, eyes locked on her. Thomas, emboldened by the silence, chuckled softly, as if the matter were already settled. To him, this was sport, a chance to belittle a younger black female lawmaker who dared challenge his authority. To Crockett, it was something else entirely, a test she had spent her whole life preparing for. And that's what made the silence so unsettling. It wasn't the silence of defeat, it was the silence before a storm. Because Jasmine Crockett had stood in courtrooms where the stakes were life and death. She had defended those who had no voice, stood against systems designed to break people like her. Every time someone had underestimated her, it hadn't weakened her. It had sharpened her. And here, under the bright glare of the nation's highest court, that resolve was about to be unleashed. The chamber held its breath. Thomas still wore that smirk. And then, with a quiet breath and words as sharp as any gavel, she began to speak. What unfolded in that chamber wasn't just a sharp exchange between two public figures. It was a collision of eras, ideologies, and the very question of who gets to define legal authority in America. On one side sat Justice Clarence Thomas, a man who had spent more than 3 decades shaping the nation's judicial landscape from the highest court in the land. His word had altered laws, tilted balances, and defined precedents. He was the embodiment of entrenched power, conservative, untouchable, and in his own mind, unassailable. On the other stood Representative Jasmine Crockett, younger, sharper, and forged in the furnace of a very different America. She wasn't born into influence. She didn't inherit political capital. Everything she brought into that room was earned, piece by piece, case by case. She was part of a new wave of leaders who didn't fit the traditional mold. Black, female, unapologetically progressive, and unwilling to bow to systems that had long dismissed people like her. That's what made Thomas's mockery more than a personal insult. It was an attempt to reassert a hierarchy that was being challenged before his eyes. It was the voice of the old guard telling the new generation to know its place, and it was precisely why Crockett's calm mattered so much. She wasn't just defending herself. She was standing for every person who had ever been told they were too inexperienced, too emotional, too different to belong in the halls of power. The stakes rippled far beyond the chamber walls. America was already in the midst of a reckoning over who gets to speak, who gets believed, and whose vision of justice would shape the decades ahead. Questions of expertise were now tangled with race, gender, and ideology. Was authority something granted by time and tradition? Or could it be claimed by those who understood the law not just as theory, but as a lived reality for millions who had been failed by it? Crockett's presence answered that question without a word. She represented a growing force in American politics, one that refused to separate law from life, that believed justice wasn't just written in dusty legal opinions, but in the courage to challenge those who misused power. And that's why this clash wasn't simply about egos. It was about legitimacy itself. Thomas shifted in his chair, still wearing that patronizing grin, unaware that the ground beneath him was shifting too. This wasn't the kind of opponent he was used to, one who played by the old rules of deference and decorum. Crockett wasn't there to trade insults or win headlines. She was there to hold a mirror to power and demand accountability. Every camera lens, every pen poised over a notepad, every social media feed waiting to explode, they all sensed it. This wasn't going to be a fleeting exchange lost in the noise of Washington. It was something deeper, something that would be replayed on cable news loops, dissected in op-eds, and shared millions of times online. Because in that room, something larger than the two individuals was at stake, the soul of American justice itself. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't just about to respond. She was about to redefine the terms of the conversation, and in doing so, challenge everything the old order believed was untouchable, because this was more than an exchange. It would become one of the most replayed showdowns in political history, and what happened next would leave the nation stunned. To understand the weight of that smirk Clarence Thomas wore as he mocked Jasmine Crockett, you have to understand the man behind it, and the empire he spent decades building around himself. Clarence Thomas wasn't always the towering conservative force he is today. He was born into poverty in Pinpoint, Georgia, a small, isolated black community founded by freed slaves. His childhood was marked by hardship, dirt floors, segregated schools, and a relentless struggle to survive. Raised by a strict grandfather who preached discipline above all else, Thomas learned early how to navigate a world determined to keep him small. That origin story could have forged empathy, a lifelong dedication to lifting others as he climbed. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. By the time President George H.W. Bush nominated him to the Supreme Court in 1991, Thomas had reinvented himself. He spoke not of solidarity but of self-reliance. He positioned himself as proof that personal responsibility could overcome systemic injustice, a message tailor-made for the conservative movement. His confirmation hearing, overshadowed by Anita Hill's sexual harassment testimony, turned him into a symbol of victimhood for the right. He emerged from that firestorm embittered, distrustful of the press, and determined to wage a cultural war from the bench, and so he did. For decades, Thomas built a reputation as the most conservative justice on the court, a man willing to overturn precedent, dismantle voting rights protections, and reshape America's legal landscape according to a rigid originalist vision. He rarely spoke during oral arguments, preferring silence to spectacle. But when he did speak, it was often to dismiss challenges to his worldview as unserious or ill-informed. He wielded intellectual superiority like a shield, mocking critics as naive, radical, or ignorant of the Constitution's true meaning. But behind the robe and rhetoric lay a more troubling story, one that threatened to unravel the very legitimacy of his legacy. Over the years, investigative reports revealed that Thomas had accepted lavish gifts and luxury trips from billionaire benefactors, some with interests before the court, private jets, island vacations, exclusive retreats, all quietly bestowed upon a justice whose decisions could shape the fates of industries and ideologies. And when pressed on these glaring conflicts of interest, Thomas deflected, dismissed, or simply refused to answer. Accountability, it seemed, was for others. Then came the revelations about his wife, Ginny Thomas, a vocal conservative activist deeply involved in efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Her messages to key figures in that effort raised alarming questions about impartiality, yet Thomas did not recuse himself from cases directly connected to those events. Critics saw a justice who had once railed against corruption now entangled in it. A man who had risen from poverty on the strength of principle now accused of protecting power at all costs. It was here that the contradiction cut deepest. Clarence Thomas had long cast himself as the embodiment of the American dream, proof that anyone, no matter how poor or marginalized, could rise to the pinnacle of power. And yet, from that pinnacle, he often ruled in ways that made it harder for others to follow. He sided with decisions that gutted voting rights protections, weakened affirmative action, and narrowed avenues for accountability against the wealthy and powerful. It was as if, having climbed the ladder, he was content to pull it up behind him. And that arrogance, the belief that his seat on the bench rendered him untouchable, became his defining trait. In debates and public appearances, Thomas leaned on his stature, wielding decades of judicial authority as a bludgeon against dissent. He mocked challenges as beneath him, sneered at woke critics, and positioned himself as the last guardian of a constitutional order under siege. It was a playbook honed over years: dismiss, belittle, and never concede an inch. But that same playbook also revealed a weakness. Thomas had spent decades surrounded by deference, from clerks, colleagues, and allies who treated his words as gospel. He was accustomed to being the final voice in the room, not the one being challenged. And so, when he faced someone like Jasmine Crockett, someone who didn't flinch at his stature, didn't shrink under his ridicule, his usual weapons began to dull. The very traits that had once shielded him: the mocking tone, the disdain for dissent, the reliance on institutional authority, now risked exposing just how insulated he had become. His smirk, meant to humiliate, instead revealed a man who had forgotten what it was like to be questioned, to be held accountable, to be reminded that power is not the same as righteousness. And that's why this moment mattered so much. Because for all the lifetime appointments, for all the billionaire allies and decades of unchecked influence, Clarence Thomas had never faced a reckoning quite like this, but all the lifetime. Appointments and conservative allies in the world couldn't prepare him for Jasmine Crockett, before she was the woman, staring down a Supreme Court justice without blinking. Jasmine Crockett was a little girl from St. Louis, Missouri, who knew the world was not built to welcome her. She was born into a working-class family that had to fight for every scrap of opportunity. Her mother, a teacher, and her father, a postal worker, taught her early that dignity wasn't something handed to you. It was something you claimed. Day after day, in a world eager to deny it. From an early age, Jasmine saw injustice up close. She watched neighbors lose their homes over predatory loans, classmates get written off by teachers because of their zip code, and friends treated as criminals for the color of their skin. These weren't abstract political issues. They were the fabric of her daily life. And they lit a fire in her. She devoured books about civil rights giants, studied court rulings the way other kids studied sports stats, and asked endless questions about how laws were made and who they were meant to serve. By the time she walked into law school, Jasmine wasn't just chasing a career. She was on a mission. Her professors noticed it. That sharpness in her questions, the urgency in her arguments. She wasn't there to play it safe or climb ladders quietly. She was there to fight. And when she graduated and began practicing law, that mission took shape in courtrooms where few were willing to stand. She didn't start at a prestigious corporate firm with marble floors and million-dollar retainers. She built her reputation in overworked public defenders' offices and small legal aid clinics, representing clients who couldn't afford to pay but couldn't afford to be ignored. Domestic violence survivors, teenagers charged as adults, workers cheated out of wages. These were her people. And for them, she was relentless. In one of her earliest cases, Jasmine defended a young black man wrongfully accused of armed robbery based on a shaky eyewitness testimony. The prosecution was confident, until Jasmine dismantled their case piece by piece, exposing contradictions, uncovering withheld evidence, and showing the jury how bias had poisoned the investigation. The verdict, not guilty. It was more than a win. It was a message that even the most overlooked lives deserved a defense as fierce as any billionaire's. Her courage didn't stop there. She took on police misconduct cases that others warned were career suicide. She challenged voter suppression laws in her state, arguing that democracy meant nothing if entire communities were kept from the ballot box. Each fight brought new threats, new insults, new attempts to silence her. But instead of breaking her, they sharpened her, forged her into something stronger, and then came politics. Crockett hadn't planned to run for office, but after years of watching lawmakers undermine the very communities she fought for, she realized that courtroom victories could only go so far. The laws themselves had to change. So she ran, and the political establishment scoffed. They called her too loud, too radical, too inexperienced. But the people knew her. They had seen her fight when no one else would. They elected her not just as a representative, but as a reflection of their own struggle and hope. In Congress, Jasmine carried that same fire with her. She refused to shrink in hearings dominated by career politicians and corporate lobbyists. She called out hypocrisy, demanded answers, and pushed legislation aimed at transparency, accountability, and justice. And every time someone tried to mock her, for her accent, for her passion, for her refusal to know her place, she turned those insults into fuel. Her rise wasn't the story of someone invited into power. It was the story of someone who broke down the door, and it was precisely that journey, the long climb from overlooked child to legal warrior to congresswoman, that made her so dangerous to people like Clarence Thomas. Because she hadn't just studied injustice from a distance. She had lived it, fought it, and beaten it again and again. And perhaps most threatening of all, she couldn't be intimidated. Every sneer about her qualifications reminded her of professors who doubted her. Every eye roll at her passion echoed the courtroom whispers that she was too emotional to win. And every attempt to sideline her only brought back the faces of clients who had no one else in their corner. She carried them all into that chamber. Every slight, every dismissal, every battle scar. They were the reason she could stand across from one of the most powerful men in America and not flinch. To her critics, Jasmine Crockett was just another freshman congresswoman punching above her weight. But to those who knew her story, she was something far more profound. A vessel for generations of struggle, a living testament to resilience, and a reminder that brilliance doesn't always come wrapped in elite credentials or cloaked in institutional privilege. Sometimes it walks in wearing the scars of battles fought far from the halls of power, and that is exactly why it's unstoppable. And as Clarence Thomas smirked down from the bench, convinced that his decades of authority would cow her into silence, he couldn't see what was coming. Jasmine Crockett wasn't there just to defend herself. She was there to defend every person who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or mocked for daring to challenge the powerful. Every time they told her she didn't belong, she built a stronger case. And today, that case was about to be heard. The chamber was heavy with silence at first, the kind of silence that lives right before a storm. Clarence Thomas, leaning back in his chair, had tasted blood with his earlier jab and wasn't about to stop there. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and went in for another strike. "Congresswoman," he said, drawing out the title with theatrical disdain. "I've read some of your legal work. Passionate, yes, but this isn't about passion. This is constitutional law. This is centuries of jurisprudence and precedent, and frankly, I don't see much evidence you understand that." The room shifted. A few quiet chuckles slipped out from his allies seated nearby. Others exchanged wary glances, sensing the condescension crossing into something uglier. Thomas wasn't just questioning her arguments. He was questioning her right to even be in the room. He wasn't done. "This isn't a street protest, Ms. Crockett," he continued, leaning forward now, his tone dripping with mock mentorship. "This is the Supreme Court. We deal in reason, not rhetoric. If you want to grandstand for the cameras, perhaps Congress is the place. But here we require something more, substantive." The insult landed like a slap, and Thomas knew it. He gave a small, satisfied smile, certain he had reduced her to a novice. The audience's murmurs grew louder, some laughing nervously, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The dynamic was textbook. An older, entrenched figure of power publicly diminishing a younger black congresswoman's intellect. It was meant to humiliate, to reassert the old order. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't rush to defend herself. She didn't interrupt or try to talk over him. Instead, she remained still, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes locked on his with quiet, unwavering focus. If Thomas expected a flustered rebuttal or an angry outburst, he was about to be disappointed. He tried again, sensing the moment slipping but desperate to keep control. "Tell me, Congresswoman," he said, voice laced with mock curiosity. "How many constitutional cases have you argued before an appellate court? How many landmark rulings have your legal briefs influenced? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems your experience is limited." The laughter grew louder this time. A few reporters at the back of the room scribbled frantically, sensing a headline forming. Social media notifications buzzed in their pockets as clips of Thomas's taunts were already being clipped, captioned, and shared. Hashtags like "Sound mocked on the bench" and "Mush Thomas takedown" began to surface online. But those who had followed Jasmine Crockett's career knew something Thomas didn't. Silence, for her, was never surrender. It was calculation. She tilted her head slightly, almost as if studying him, not with anger, but with the kind of patience that unnerves even the most confident opponent. Every insult, every smirk, every patronizing word was ammunition he didn't realize he was handing her. Thomas, emboldened by her stillness, pressed on. "I admire your enthusiasm," he said, feigning a conciliatory tone. "But constitutional law isn't a place for slogans. It's a discipline forged over centuries by scholars, jurists, and great legal minds. Minds that understand nuance, history, and restraint. Something I'm not sure your background quite prepares you for." The chamber was no longer laughing. The air had shifted. What had begun as mockery was starting to feel like overreach. Even some of Thomas's supporters glanced at each other uneasily. Was this a debate, or a public belittling? And still, Crockett said nothing. Her silence had become louder than any words could be. It wasn't weakness. It was the stillness of a lion before it pounces. The quiet before a storm tears the sky apart. Each second of her composure tightened the tension in the room, winding it tighter and tighter until it hummed. Finally, she drew a breath. Slow, controlled, intentional. The murmurs faded. Even Thomas paused, his self-satisfied grin faltering just slightly. Cameras zoomed in. Every eye was on her now. She hadn't spoken a single word, and yet the balance of power in the room had begun to shift. And then, as one reporter would later write, with surgical precision and a voice that silenced the chamber, she began. The silence was deafening. It stretched on for what felt like an eternity until Jasmine Crockett finally spoke. And when she did, her voice was low, steady, and sharp enough to slice through steel. "Justice Thomas," she began, not raising her tone but commanding the room all the same. "You're right about one thing. Constitutional law is about discipline. It's about history, nuance, and restraint, and that's exactly why I'm here." A ripple moved through the chamber. Thomas shifted slightly, leaning back in his chair as if bracing for what was coming. Crockett glanced around the room, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, then returned her focus to the man who had tried to humiliate her. "You asked how many appellate cases I've argued," she continued. "The answer is enough. Enough to know what it means to stand next to someone who has no money, no power, and no voice, and still make the Constitution work for them. Enough to know that law isn't just written in courtrooms. It's lived in the streets, in classrooms, in neighborhoods forgotten by the powerful." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Thomas raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. But there was a flicker of something else now. Doubt. Crockett didn't stop. "You talk about centuries of jurisprudence. So let's talk about jurisprudence. Brown v. Board of Education. The Supreme Court declared that separate was not equal. It wasn't just a legal ruling. It was a moral one. Loving v. Virginia. The court struck down bans on interracial marriage, affirming the right to love across color lines. Gideon v. Wainwright. The court reminded this nation that even the poorest among us deserve a lawyer." She stepped, closer to the microphone, her tone now carrying the authority of someone who knew she was standing on solid ground. All of those decisions were made possible not by mockery, not by arrogance, but by courage. The courage to look beyond tradition and power and remember the human beings at stake. The audience was rapt. Even the ones who had laughed minutes earlier now sat frozen, their eyes locked on her. "And yet," Crockett said, pausing just long enough to let the silence build, "we sit here today with a justice who has accepted luxury vacations and lavish gifts from billionaires with business before this very court, and dares to lecture others on integrity." The room exploded. Audible gasps, murmurs, even a few shouted exclamations. Thomas's jaw tightened and he shifted in his seat. The reference was unmistakable. The ProPublica revelations of undisclosed gifts and private jet trips from conservative megadonors. Crockett pressed on, each word a deliberate strike. You mock my legal experience, Justice Thomas, but my record doesn't include undisclosed yacht trips or $500,000 real estate deals. My oath wasn't to any billionaire. It was, and is, to the people I serve. The chamber erupted into spontaneous applause, quickly hushed by gavel bangs but impossible to contain entirely. Even reporters couldn't help themselves, some whispering "wow" under their breath as they typed furiously. Thomas tried to interrupt. Congresswoman, but Crockett didn't yield. And you question my understanding of constitutional law? She said, raising her voice slightly now, the fire behind her composure finally breaking through. Let's examine Shelby County verse. Holder, the decision you joined that gutted the Voting Rights Act. A law fought for with blood, sweat, and lives. You called it outdated. But within hours of that ruling, states moved to suppress black and brown voters. Was that constitutional restraint? Or was it political expediency? The tension was electric. Thomas's lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. His silence spoke volumes. And if we're talking about understanding the Constitution, Crockett continued, let's not forget Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, where this court stripped away a half-century of reproductive rights relied upon by millions of American women. You called it judicial humility, but overturning precedent and imposing ideology is not humility, it's hubris. Another wave of gasps swept through the chamber. Cameras zoomed in on Thomas, who stared ahead, expression tightening. He was no longer in control of the moment. Crockett stepped closer to the bench, her tone dropping back to calm precision. You see, Justice Thomas, my career may not include decades on this bench, but I have stood in overcrowded courtrooms defending clients who couldn't afford representation. I have fought police departments that thought they were above the law. I have challenged corporations that poisoned communities and thought no one would hold them accountable. And I have done it not for applause, not for power, but because justice, real justice, demands it. Then she delivered the line that would echo across the nation. Real justice isn't about the power you hold. It's about the people you serve. The words hung in the air like a bell tolling through the room. The crowd was silent, as if absorbing a seismic shift. Then, slowly, a few people began to clap. It grew, hesitant at first, then louder, more confident, until the chamber itself seemed to roar with approval. Thomas glanced down, adjusting his glasses again, but his usual composure was gone. He reached for his notes, then stopped. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words he had once wielded so easily suddenly felt fragile. Crockett wasn't finished. So yes, Justice Thomas, I am passionate. Because the Constitution isn't just parchment in a museum. It's the promise of equality, of accountability, of democracy itself. And when those entrusted with upholding it betray that promise, it is not amateur hour to call them out. It is our duty. Another round of applause broke out, this one unstoppable. Even some of Thomas's allies couldn't help but acknowledge the moment with nods or murmured agreement. Crockett stepped back slightly, her gaze still fixed on Thomas. You can question my credentials, you can mock my experience, but you cannot erase the truth. And the truth is this: power is not legitimacy. Title is not righteousness. And no robe, no lifetime appointment, no billionaire benefactor can shield anyone from accountability forever. Thomas shifted again, but the fight was gone. His earlier smirk had vanished, replaced by something closer to discomfort. Or perhaps the dawning realization that he was no longer the unquestioned authority in the room. The moderator cleared their throat, trying to regain order, but the moment had already slipped from their grasp. The cameras captured everything: Crockett's unwavering stance, Thomas's shaken expression, the palpable electricity in the room. Within minutes, clips would flood social media. Within hours, Headlines would dominate every major outlet. And as Crockett returned to her seat, the final words she had spoken still echoed in the chamber, impossible to ignore. And the shockwaves, from that moment, a journalist would later write, were only just beginning. It took less than 30 minutes for the clip to hit the internet, and less than 3 hours for it to become a cultural earthquake. The confrontation between Justice Clarence Thomas and Representative Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a headline. It was every headline. By nightfall, hashtags were burning through social media like wildfire. Thomas exposed surged past 3 million mentions, while Dr. Crockett clapback climbed even faster, becoming the #1 trending topic in the United States and cracking the global top 10. Short clips of her evisceration of Thomas, from her calm dissection of case law to that searing line, "Real justice isn't about the power you hold, it's about the people you serve," were being reposted by activists, celebrities, and even late-night hosts. One viral post simply read, "Jasmine Crockett didn't just speak truth to power, she made power listen." Cable news seized on the story immediately. On MSNBC, hosts replayed the moment Crockett called out Thomas for accepting billionaire gifts, overlaying it with archived footage of the justice declining to comment on ethics allegations. CNN ran a split-screen timeline of Thomas's controversial decisions against Crockett's courtroom advocacy for vulnerable clients. Even conservative outlets, usually quick to shield Thomas from criticism, were forced to grapple with the optics. It's hard to deny. One right-leaning analyst admitted on air that Justice Thomas looked outmatched today. It wasn't just a disagreement. It was a dismantling. Editorial boards echoed that sentiment. The Washington Post published a blistering op-ed titled "The Day Power Was Questioned," arguing that Crockett's challenge had pierced the veneer of untouchability that has long protected the Supreme Court. The Atlantic called the exchange a watershed moment, while The Guardian described it as a reckoning decades in the making. But perhaps the most striking shift came from within the legal community itself. Former clerks, law professors, and even a few retired judges weighed in, many praising Crockett's composure and depth of argument. "She didn't just quote precedent," wrote one constitutional scholar. "She reminded us why precedent exists, to serve justice, not to sanctify power." Meanwhile, Crockett's own platforms exploded. Overnight, her follower count doubled. Donations to grassroots legal funds she supported spiked by 400%. Thousands of messages poured in from across the country. Single mothers, law students, activists, immigrants, all thanking her for standing up, not just to Clarence Thomas, but to an entire system that often feels unreachable. "Watching you today," one viral comment read, "I felt like we were finally being heard." It wasn't all applause, of course. Thomas loyalists tried to mount a counteroffensive, dismissing Crockett's remarks as political theater. But their efforts struggled to gain traction. The footage was simply too compelling. Every attempt to paint her as inexperienced was undercut by her precise citations and the haunting questions she had posed. Questions Thomas had conspicuously failed to answer. Even within conservative ranks, a few voices broke ranks. One former GOP strategist wrote on X, "Agree with her or not, Crockett exposed a vulnerability the court has long ignored: public trust. Mockery won't fix that. Accountability might." The debate spilled far beyond legal circles. College campuses lit up with teach-ins about judicial ethics. Protesters gathered outside the Supreme Court, holding signs reading, "No one is above the law," and "Power must answer." Think tanks announced emergency panels on judicial reform. And late-night comedians turned Thomas's smirk into a meme. One captioned, "When you realize the rookie brought receipts." But perhaps the most profound impact was quieter. Across dinner tables and comment threads, Americans began revisiting questions many had grown numb to. Who watches the watchers? What happens when lifetime power goes unchecked? And why does it take a lone Congresswoman's courage to spark that conversation? For Crockett, the moment was both vindicating and humbling. Asked in a brief interview about the viral explosion, she offered only this: "This isn't about me versus Justice Thomas. It's about a system that has to answer to the people, not the other way around." Yet behind her measured tone, everyone could sense the shift. Something fundamental had changed. The old dynamics, deference to authority, silence in the face of mockery, the assumption that Supreme Court justices stood beyond reproach, had been shaken. And in political war rooms from Washington to Wall Street, strategists were already recalculating. Crockett wasn't just a rising congresswoman anymore. She was a national figure, and a dangerous one to those invested in the status quo. As the night deepened and the hashtags continued their relentless climb, one commentator summed it up on a primetime panel. History isn't made by polite conversations. It's made by moments like this, when someone dares to speak truth to entrenched power and refuses to back down. Crockett didn't just win a debate. She reframed what power means in America, and somewhere, deep within the marble halls of the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, for decades the embodiment of untouchable judicial authority, was left to reckon with a truth he had not expected to face. His word was no longer final. The people were watching, and they were no longer silent. The confrontation had ended hours earlier, but its echo was only growing louder. And as dawn approached over Washington, one thing was already clear. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Days after the confrontation, as the storm of reactions continued to rage across the country, Jasmine Crockett stepped before a podium, not in a courtroom, not in a committee hearing, but in front of a crowd of ordinary Americans gathered on the steps of the U.S. Capitol. The autumn sun fell across the marble, and phones rose like a forest as people prepared to record what many believed would become a defining speech of a generation. She began not with triumph, but with humility. "I didn't come here to humiliate anyone," she said, her voice steady and deliberate. "I came here to remind this country of something too many have forgotten, that power is not a crown to be worn. It is a responsibility to be earned, every single day, by serving the people who entrusted you with it." The crowd fell silent. It wasn't the tone of a victory lap. It was the tone of someone trying to widen the lens, to turn a viral clash into a deeper reckoning. Crockett spoke about her own journey, not to glorify it, but to connect it to something larger. "I was never supposed to be here. That's what they told me again and again. Too young, too black, too loud, too unpolished. And yet every insult became fuel. Every barrier they built became a step I climbed. Because democracy isn't about who they say belongs. It's about who refuses to be kept out." Her words echoed across the plaza and through millions of live streams. They were more than rhetoric. They were a reminder of America's promise and its unfinished work. "This is not about Clarence Thomas," she continued. "This is not about one justice or one argument. This is about a truth bigger than any bench or title. Democracy was never meant to serve the powerful. It was built, brick by brick, struggle by struggle, to serve the people. And when those in power forget that, it is not disrespectful to challenge them. It is patriotic." Applause rolled through the crowd like a wave. Crockett's message reached beyond the partisan divide, striking at something elemental. Power wants you to believe it is unshakable. It wants you to think that questioning it is dangerous, that resistance is futile. But I promise you, arrogance crumbles before courage. Power trembles before truth, and when ordinary people refuse to be silenced, no title, no robe, no institution is beyond accountability. She paused, letting the words hang, then spoke directly to those watching from home, to the immigrants, the working-class families, the young people who had flooded her inbox in the days since the hearing. To anyone who has ever been told you don't belong in the rooms where decisions are made, I want you to know something. You are the reason those rooms exist. They are meant for you, and your voice, your story, your truth is more powerful than they will ever admit. Her tone shifted from defiant to hopeful, and for a moment, the chaos of Washington politics seemed to fall away. Our democracy is not perfect. It is messy, flawed, often frustrating, but it is also alive, and it belongs to us. It belongs to the mother working 2 jobs who still finds time to vote. It belongs to the student marching for a future they believe in. It belongs to the immigrant who still believes this country can live up to its ideals. And yes, it even belongs to those who mock and belittle, because their voices too are part of this messy, beautiful experiment. The speech built toward its crescendo, a final rallying cry not of anger, but of possibility. The fight for justice is not a moment. It is a lifetime. And every time someone dares to speak truth to power, every time a voice refuses to be silenced, that fight grows stronger. That's what this moment was about. Not me, not him, but us, and the America we are still becoming. As the final words left her lips, the applause was thunderous. It wasn't just celebration. It was recognition, a collective understanding that something had shifted. Because in the end, this was never about a single debate or a viral clip. It was about the deeper truth that power without accountability is tyranny, and that even the most entrenched authority must answer to the people it serves. And in a system built to silence voices like hers, Jasmine Crockett's rang louder than ever. In the end, the story of this clash wasn't about a single insult, or even a single courtroom moment. It was about what happens when arrogance collides head-on with unshakable truth. Clarence Thomas tried to diminish Jasmine Crockett with a smirk and a sneer, mocking her experience and questioning her very place in the room. But she didn't shout. She didn't crumble. She stood firm, and with precision, courage, and unrelenting facts, she turned his ridicule into rubble. What began as a dismissive jab became one of the most unforgettable reversals in modern political memory. A lifetime justice, untouchable and unchallenged for decades, was forced to reckon with a congresswoman who represented not just herself, but a generation demanding accountability. And as millions watched, the power dynamics shifted, because dignity and truth will always outshine arrogance and entitlement if moments like this matter to you, if you believe democracy is strongest when the powerful are held accountable. If you believe voices like Jasmine Crockett's deserve to be amplified, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to Liberty Leak for daily political drama, jaw-dropping confrontations, and stories where justice isn't just spoken about, it's delivered. Join a growing community that refuses to accept corruption as normal, that celebrates courage over cynicism, and that believes truth still matters in American politics. Because this isn't just about watching headlines. It's about understanding the battles shaping our future and standing on the side of those brave enough to fight them. This was more than a debate. It was a reckoning. This is Liberty Leak. And here the truth always gets the last word.